afternoon. Welcome to Crown, Cloak, and Dagger with Richard Aldrich and Rory Cormac. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very pleased to have Richard and Rory joining us from the UK to discuss the American edition of their book. And it is a great book. These two notable historians have a number of books to their name and are each associated with universities in the UK. Richard with the University of Warwick and Rory with the University of Nottingham. Their subject matter expertise is diverse, ranging from cyber diplomacy to coups, but today they are united around the British monarchy and secret intelligence from Victoria to Elizabeth II. I'll be asking Richard and Rory some questions to move us through key topics in the book, and then we will turn it over to your questions. And if you've been with us before, or if this is your first time, please write in the questions with the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. All right, let's get started and begin at the beginning of the book with Queen Victoria and her personal intelligence network. Can you tell us how she came to know so much and what impact this had on her professional services?
Of course we can. Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today. Queen Victoria loved intelligence. She just adored it. And she was the head of a intricate web of royals across Europe. Now, what were they also doing? Feeding information back to Victoria. She had sources across the entire continent. She was trained in it from an early age by her uncle, the King of the Belgians, who gave her lessons in deception and in counterintelligence, how to write clues that you hope the adversary's intelligence agencies are going to intercept, and how to send secret messages that way, that kind of thing. And she gradually built up this network. Her star agent was her daughter, Vicky, who married into the Prussian royal family. And she was feeding back this wonderful combination of private family gossip. How are the kids? How's the dog doing? And then would drop in things like mobilization plans for the Prussian military. And it was all in the same very broad understanding of intelligence. And this meant that she often had better intelligence than the government. Her private informal family networks were giving her so much better material than the official British bureaucracy, which was, to be frank, kind of non-existent in the 19th century. To the extent that in about the 1880s, so she'd been on the throne for a long time. It's a lovely moment. The new foreign secretary, a guy called Lord Rosebery, turns up at the palace to get his seals or whatever they do from the Queen. And she says to him, look, if anything's going on at cabinet, if you find anything interesting out, don't go to the Prime Minister. Come to me. I have my own sources. I have the best sources. And I'd love to have seen his face as he's being lectured on sources by the Queen. And there's a kind of serious point to this, which is the Queen could support government policy using her wonderful sources. And there are some wonderful moments of her sitting down with the Prime Minister and poring over raw intelligence, and she would be helping him to interpret it. She was an analyst as well as a spy master, because she knew the European families inside out. But when she didn't agree with government policy, she could use her sources to try to manipulate it and try to bend it to support her dynastic interests. And this, we think, spurred on British intelligence to become a bit better and a bit more formal to help answer the Queen's questions, but also to help rebut some of the Queen's discreet meddling.
I also, this is probably something everyone in your country knows, but there were 8 assassination attempts on her life. How do you see that shadow cast across time on the royal family? Are there still ripples today? I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, and you see this.
Sorry, Rory, you go ahead.
This is the reason, the second reason why she loved intelligence so much. Not only was it about wielding influence as much as she could over the government, it was also keeping her alive. This is the era of Fenian terrorism at the start of the century. It's and towards the end of the century. This is the era of anarchism. She's seeing her relatives being murdered across Europe, and she knows that intelligence is keeping her safe. So she's constantly berating the government for more protection. She's so enthusiastic, she becomes almost like a mini ballistics expert. She goes and tells the police. She says, "Show me the bullet holes in the castle walls where this assassin tried to kill me. I want to see it." She has this morbid fascination with it. And she also, there was one lovely story where an assassin tried to kill her, missed and got away. And so the next day she used herself as bait with Prince Albert, and the two of them go on this carriage ride with some undercover police officers, ready and waiting. And they're going back, they do the same route again, waiting for the guy to reappear. And sure enough, he does. And then there's this ridiculous moment where the undercover police officer loses all control of himself because he's in front of the Queen, and he stands up and he salutes at just the wrong moment where the assassin steps out of the crowd. Fortunately, he missed, but it shows again her bravery. And it's clearly, we think it's influenced the creation of British Special Branch, and I'll let Richard say, it has had all sorts of ripples across the succeeding couple of centuries.
Yeah, I mean, clearly Victoria and Albert just regarded themselves as targets on a shooting range, and Albert actually designed a metal umbrella, a bulletproof umbrella, because they were so used to being shot at. It seems that Victoria didn't use it very much; it was quite heavy. But I mean, many of the people attacking the British royal family were people who were disturbed, had mental health issues. But across Europe, other members of royal families are being killed almost by the year. And it just becomes that they kind of become a little bit inured to it. So her grandson, the future George V, is sent to a wedding in Spain. The wedding party is bombed. All the royals turn up at the wedding breakfast covered in blood. And George V said, I stood up to give a speech and wish them a long and happy life, but it seemed a bit comic because everybody was just covered in, they'd all just been bombed. And this just seemed to be, for decades, this is just the everyday life of the royal families in Europe. Is extraordinary.
Well, the context that you put around just people just being targets is incredible. And thanks for even touching upon, our presidential assassination. So, just seeing how worldwide the shooting range is, really gave a lot of depth to that. So thanks. And since you mentioned George V, we're gonna skip a king, sad to say, because we only have an hour. And we're going to skip ahead to King George V. And this is a letter we have on display at the Spy Museum. During World War I, British intelligence invited King George V and Queen Mary to sign their names using invisible ink smuggled into Britain by an enemy agent. He soaked his bootlaces in the solution, and the king's signature has been developed on this document. And I didn't know if you wanted to comment at all on the interest that King George and his wife had with the intelligence services.
Well, King George was actually at the Naval Academy with the head of MI6, so they were, sailing buddies in their youth. And clearly they collaborated and talked about all the events that were going on across Europe, including the Russian Revolution in 1917.
So we also have quite a remarkable artifact on display at the museum that connects in with the story of the Romanovs, the Russian Revolution. King George lost his dear cousin Nicky to assassination during the Russian Revolution. This was, of course, Tsar Nicholas. And the box that we have here links Sidney Riley, who's the notable Riley ace of spies, and diplomat Bruce Lockhart. Riley was a legendary spy who worked for the intelligence service MI6. Can you tell us more about the King's relationship with MI6 and its operations in Russia around this time?
Sure. I mean, this is the story of two disasters, really, because in early 1917, a moderate revolutionary regime comes to power in Russia. They've got the Tsar locked up, but they're actually quite willing to let him go if he wants to. The reason he doesn't get away is because the Tsar wants to stay put. The Tsar and his family think they're going to be allowed to live out their lives in a kind of holiday camp on the Black Sea. So, the door is open and they don't walk free. So that moment of escape, quite often, the British king is blamed for not letting them come to Britain, but actually the Russian royal family wouldn't come. That was the moment when MI6 could have rescued them. But this artifact is fascinating because it points to a second episode. Later on, when Lenin comes to power, the Russian royal family are moved to the middle of Russia. They're harder to reach. What do we think triggers the final execution of the Russian royal family? It's a number of operations against Lenin, run by people like Bruce Lockhart, run by people like Sidney Riley. There's essentially an intelligence war going on against Lenin. And at this point, Lenin says, I've had enough. The Russian royal family are too dangerous. We need to have them executed. So we don't know the full story, but it looks as if the really provocative covert actions launched by the British, launched by Riley, launched by Lockhart, played a part in the sad and eventual death of the Russian royal family.
Well, very sad. Let's move ahead to something sad in a very different way. This is following George on the throne was Edward VIII. And as a native of Maryland here in the United States, I've spent my life quite interested in Wallace Simpson, the Maryland woman who captured his heart, for better or worse. She was a divorced woman and married when the two met. Edward abdicated the throne to be with her, the woman he loved, in his words. The former king and Wallace married and became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Rumors around this couple and their controversial allegiances abound. How big a security threat do you think he and the Duchess of Windsor truly presented? And would it have been worse if he'd stayed king?
So this is one of these are the questions we love, the what if questions. What would have happened if? What would have happened if they'd stayed on the throne? Almost certainly Britain would not have gone to war with Germany. So they both favor peace. They're both quite pro-German. So in 1939, Britain would not have gone to war with Germany over Poland. Instead, I think Britain and Germany would have concluded an alliance, allowing Hitler a free hand to attack Russia in 1941. The interesting question for everyone today is what happens when we get to December 1941? Because at this point, not only does Japan declare war on America, attacks Pearl Harbor, but a few days later, Hitler, who would have been an ally of Britain, an ally of Edward VIII, an ally of Wallace Simpson, declares war on America. What would have happened then? A pro-German king and queen allied to a Germany at war with America. It's, you know, the mind boggles. The mind boggles. It doesn't get more dramatic than that.
You're laughing, Rory. Do you have any comments on this?
The transition, I think, is quite striking because they started off not being seen particularly as a security threat. And when he was Prince of Wales, he was seen as a playboy prince. He was a blackmail risk because of his various affairs and whatnot. He was also he was buying expensive jewels for people, and King George is worried about this, and he asks MI5 and Special Branch to spy on him, essentially. And there's a bit of resistance amongst MI5 because they say, well, this is not a security issue. Edward and Wallace, Edward at the time, wasn't a security threat. This is about the private lives, the gossip of the royal family and the elites. And gradually we see a shift. MI5 are persuaded to sanction it, to get involved, because suddenly it moves from, is Edward being blackmailed, is he being a naughty prince and a naughty king, to is he a security risk? Who is he sleeping with? Who is Wallace Simpson sleeping with? What are their attitudes towards Germany and towards fascism? And gradually it becomes this big security risk. And what I learned researching this was the extent of his sympathies towards fascism. It's not just the kind of classic appeasement, we don't want war because World War I was very bad. It was, we don't want war because actually some of the things that fascists stand for, Edward signed up to. And I found that quite striking. And the way history can turn on a knife point, and Richard might want to talk about it. But those moments in history where, is he going to go one way? Is he going to go the other?
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary. Even when they're in the Caribbean later in the 1940s, the worry is that a German U-boat is going to come in and rescue them and take them back to Europe, where they're going to be, essentially quislings, pro-German Nazi rulers of a conquered Britain. So, because Britain is still, on the edge in 1941, 1942, no one knows which way the war is going to go. So they remain a real security risk quite a long way through the war.
And I was also smiling because he didn't really care either, did he, Richard? He was being surveilled by MI5, by the FBI, being eavesdrops, and he was just dead brazen, knew it, and it was about the arrogance of the man.
It's really fascinating to see the impact of the surveillance, exactly as Rory says. So this surveillance is being conducted. People kind of know that it's being conducted. So Edward's friends, people like Churchill, people like Lloyd George, people like Beaverbrook, are actually very anxious about talking to him on the phone. So it kind of deters the conspirators around Edward. But actually, Edward doesn't care. He just lets go for it. Everybody's watching me. I'm just going to have fun.
Well, and you talk about, I think it's a meal when they are a meal. They never had a meal. They had an event, a dinner. And I think they just felt like even the musicians surrounding them were spying. You had a great line about that. I think it's the bagpiper.
Yeah. Edward says, well, you can report that back to 10 Downing Street. What Edward probably didn't realize is that surveillance ramps up when he goes to Florida. So, they're used to having their phones tapped, but when they turn up in Florida, Roosevelt has ordered extraordinary surveillance. So not just telephone tapping, but also microphones. So there's kind of wraparound 24 surveillance on Edward and Wallace when they turn up in Florida.
Well, one more question on Wallace, because as I have told you, quite a buff, quite interested in her. There were so many suspicions surrounding her and relationships that she had, pre-war with powerful Nazis. But one notorious thing that always comes up if you focus on Wallace is the infamous China dossier. And this is supposed to be a file containing details of Wallace's life in China. And this is long before she met the Prince of Wales. And it is supposedly compiled by the Secret Service with scandalous contents, and many of them supposed to be very lurid, and how she could have captured the Prince of Wales. What's your take on this infamous file? Because that, as a Wallace buff, is what I found super interesting in your coverage of her.
Well, of course, Rory and I wanted to get our hands on the China dossier. So in our travels, we talked to some former members of MI5, and they said, well, there were dossiers on Wallace. They were not kept in the main MI5 registry because they were too sensitive. They were kept in the director's safe. And one or two bits and pieces would be put on display at MI5 Christmas parties. If they existed at the time, they don't exist now. And they certainly weren't the China dossier, this fabled file full of sexual material that's often talked about in biographies. I think the China dossier was a fiction, but it was an important fiction. So people like Tommy Dugdale, the Prime Minister's private secretary, used this stuff essentially to conduct a propaganda war against Edward and Wallace. It was a bit like the surveillance. It was used to frighten off their friends. So it kind of had it wasn't real, but it had a real effect, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, I really appreciated that perspective on it. All right, moving away from the Windsors to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. These two became great fans of intelligence, and especially of the Special Operations Executive during World War II. And this is an image from our covert action gallery at the museum, where we have our gorgeous SOE Sleeping Beauty submersible on display. Can you tell us about how their interest and support grew and what they were particularly fascinated by?
So one of the reasons that both George VI and the Queen love special operations is because Buckingham Palace is actually full of spies. It's full of secret agents. Some of the people working around the King and Queen during the Second World War had either been in Secret Service or were kind of moonlighting. So the person who runs the royal flight by day is someone who's running secret flights into France, dropping agents by night. And this essentially allows the royal family to get into all the spy stuff, all the James Bond stuff. In 1943, the king goes off to a special operations executive camp in North Africa called Massingham. He meets lots of secret agents. He meets people like Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who are at the time is a Secret Service agent, and he just loves the toys. He loves the secret boats, the guns, all this stuff. He comes back to Britain, and he wants the rest of the royal family, the Queen, Princess Margaret, Princess Elizabeth, to see this stuff. And so he arranges with the head of the royal flight to go up to one of these secret airfields, and they all get to see the fantastic secret toys. And of course, the secret toy that the royal family love best is the exploding horse poo. The horse dung, which is essentially explosives designed as horse dung. You can leave it on the ground, on the road. No one will notice it. And the Queen picks up some of this exploding poo, brings it across to the king and says, "Look at this. Isn't this fantastic?"
We have a replica of the explosive coal on display in the museum. So I just and you know, we have the dog do transmitter, which is from much later, but is actually tiger poop. But we love all these explosive things or transmitters disguised, and I just love that story of the Queen. What were you going to add, Rory?
The king would love your covert action exhibition. I could just see him wandering around. But I was going to add the other thing that he was really interested in was Bletchley Park and D-Day as well with MI5 and the double cross deception operation. He was really interested in that, and he wanted to play a frontline role in the deception operation to convince Hitler that obviously the invasion was going to come from Dover to Calais rather than to Normandy. So MI5 come to the palace and they have this very secret meeting with the king and with his private secretary. And the upshot of it is the king ties his movements very, very carefully with the MI5 network, who are feeding a mixture of false and disinformation back to Hitler. And the king is almost a human highlighter pen for the Germans. They watch him move to see, go visit troops on the East Coast who just happen to be near Dover, for example, knowing that Hitler's intelligence will draw conclusions from that because they think that the king is about to rally the troops before D-Day. He was also quite brave. I mean, the deception operation included a part called Fortitude North, where there was going to be a supposed invasion of Norway. And to give credence to this ruse, the king flew all the way up into the North Sea to go and visit the North Sea fleet and rally those troops, knowing full well it would get reported in the British press, knowing that the Germans were watching and reading and would draw wrong conclusions from that as well. And he loved it. The diaries talked about him bamboozling the Germans. He was loving life. And again, it's a big transition from a Pisa at the start of the war to now being involved in all of the most secret elements of state.
It's really a wonderful transition, and then I think it is with great delight I read about the kind of competition between the king and Churchill. Like, you can't go there. Well, you can't go there, and then they were sort of tricking each other into where they were going. That was dangerous, but super cool.
No, you're more.
Yeah, I mean, Montgomery was. I mean, the king finally gets into northern France later in the campaign, and Montgomery's a bit cheesed off because he's got this great disguised headquarters, and the visit of the king kind of tips off the press as to where it is. So poor old Montgomery has to move out of his nice chateau into a caravan.
The book is just filled with all these glorious details. Well, we'll go on to Queen Elizabeth II, who was just 25 when she took the throne. She was young but earnest. And in the press about your book and in our own description, we mention her raising her eyebrow, and this you covered this early in her reign. So what could make Queen Elizabeth raise her eyebrows?
Well, the thing that we found most striking about her was that she received so much top secret material. She knew every secret in the land. She was a human library of state secrets. In fact, we reckon that given that she's on the throne for so long, she probably died having known more state secrets than anybody who ever lived in the history of humankind, which is quite remarkable. What does one do with those secrets? It's not just hoovering it up, and she's obviously always been very discreet. But it allows her to enact her constitutional rights, which is to encourage, advise, and warn prime ministers. And she's got this back catalogue of secret intelligence in her head. And if a prime minister was wanting to do something silly, perhaps, she could raise that famous eyebrow and say those famous words, Are you sure that's wise, Prime Minister?
But sometimes the eyebrow was a little bit more dangerous than that. You know, Rory found this fantastic section in a manuscript diary. It had been removed from the published version, but in the manuscript diary in an archive, it showed a discussion between the Queen and some Foreign Office officials about a Middle East leader who was giving Britain a little bit of trouble. And the Queen just raises an eyebrow and says, well, would it be possible to slip something in his coffee? So actually, when the Queen raises an eyebrow, it might just be a raised eyebrow. It might mean something just a little bit more dangerous, you know?
I mean, just yet another very, very titillating anecdote that you found. So Anthony Blunt, the fourth man of the Cambridge Five spy ring, got some new attention as a storyline on the Netflix series The Crown. And here is a shot of the gallery at the Spy Museum where we cover the Cambridge Five. The sources, though, that you have brought together add so much more to the rather unbelievable story of a knighted spy. I was shocked that the royal family knew him to be a spy as early as 1948, and advisor Tommy Lascelles even called him our Russian spy. Can you give us some background on how he stayed in place as surveyor of the Queen's pictures? And please, follow-up question, a little detail on that secret mission of his towards the end of World War II.
Well, it's that classic dilemma of counterintelligence, isn't it? You have a suspicion that there's a mole somewhere, and what do you do about it? Even after he admitted to being a Russian spy in exchange for this immunity deal in 1964, and the Queen was told, by the way, the Queen knew for sure that he was a Russian spy. She agreed to go along with it. She agreed not to fire him, because as soon as she did, the Russian intelligence services would, of course, then become very suspicious. They'd be alerted. It would also make other potential moles very insecure and who might be under surveillance by MI5. It could ruin entire counterintelligence operation. So the Queen agreed that he could be immune. He even got knighted after whilst being a Russian spy. And she agreed to be immune. But what we found particularly interesting from some recently declassified documents was that even after 1964, he's still working in the royal household. But he's also working with MI5 on various counter-espionage operations, and as the file said, including some which are ongoing. But at the same time, MI5 didn't trust him. And so successive Home Secretaries authorized the bugging of his telephones, which raised all sorts of fascinating questions. That he has an office in Buckingham Palace. MI5 are listening in to these conversations. Are they picking up inadvertently, but picking up conversations between him and members of the royal family, which just creates all sorts of crazy potential implications. On the follow-up with going back to the end of World War II, he had some various missions, raids on behalf of the royal family as soon as he became the royal art historian, and they're shrouded in mystery. They officially, it looks like he was going back with the royal librarian to pick up royal art until he was stopped because it looked like looting, to pick up some rare coins from Europe. But we're also pretty confident that he went back to try and pick up some incriminating archives and letters which may have been written between Edward and other members of the royal family and Hitler, which, if they ever got into the wrong hands, would be explosive for the royals. But there's nothing written down, and there's a wonderful stuff that that Richard found where it said, we agree, don't put anything about this on paper, and Blunt, and I quote, will be as silent as a tomb.
You know, and this is just so exciting and so mysterious. I think the real truth probably lies in one particular diary. Apparently, the Queen kept a very detailed diary, and of course we haven't managed to read it yet. But we you know, what's that going to tell us about Blunt? What is that going to tell us about Blunt? Perhaps still conducting intelligence operations with MI5 in the 1970s, the 1980s. We know that members of the royal family, even after he was publicly revealed, continued to be incredibly enthusiastic about him. Princess Margaret would go to parties and sound off about how much she loved him. Why was this? Was this because Blunt was really a triple agent? So many mysteries still to be unraveled.
Yeah, that it's just really juicy stuff, juicy stuff. So I have been, as I told you, as we prepared for the program, I have been wowing my friends and colleagues with stories as I read your book of the incredible ways that the royal family's international visits influenced events. And the Queen seemed particularly reticent about some dangerous situations. Could you share a few of these that seem the most staggering to you? I mean, and also, these people certainly seem like agents of influence to me. I don't know what you think.
There are so many great ones. I'll give a couple, and then Rich Rich can prompt me. We'll have a competition because there's so many great stories. So famously, you mentioned The Crown earlier. They dramatized it. She visited Ghana in 1961 to try and talk round the president Nkrumah, who was being less and less pro-British and more pro-communist. This was a dangerous time. There were attempts against his life, and she bravely went along with it and famously danced with him across the ballroom. It didn't make much of a difference, I don't think, to Ghana's subsequent security, subsequent foreign policy, but it showed real bravery. And the other one is Northern Ireland in 1977, where there was the biggest security operation of British history, really. And the British officials were quite gracious. They kind of had a back channel to the palace and said, off the record, if she doesn't want to go, she doesn't have to. We can get her out of this. And to be fair to her, she went. But there are two very, very quick things I want to say about agents of influence. The first one was in Iraq in the 1950s, when there's an Iraqi princess who was sounding off and being anti-British. The Foreign Office did not like this. So they discreetly came to the Queen and said, Your Majesty, would you mind befriending her, just nudging her very, very discreetly, very deniably, in favour of Britain? And she did. She invited her for tea at Windsor, took her to the horse racing, and gradually tried to make her a bit more pro-British. Again, sadly, I think that's an agent of influence, but sadly it didn't work out because after she completed her mission, the Iraqi Revolution happened and the royal family were toppled. And there's one other one which I want to mention because it's just so much fun. Was she was an unwitting agent of influence in the Iranian coup in 1953, because as everyone listening will know, there was an MI6 CIA covert action to try and overthrow the Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953, using the Shah. And the Shah was getting cold feet, and he wanted to run away. And somebody had to convince him to stay firm, and see it through. The American ambassador passes on a message, which is, quote, from Eden, from Queen Elizabeth, saying to the Shah, stay firm, it's fine. And the Shah receives it and says, okay, if someone as important as Queen Elizabeth thinks I should see this out, I'll see this out. And I found this document, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is the Queen meddling in a covert action. I thought it was just crazy. Richard then phones me up a few months later saying, you know that great story you found? Well, I've just found a document in the American archives which said it wasn't from Queen Elizabeth. It was from the ship, the Queen Elizabeth. Anthony Eden was on board the ship, and it was, it was a mistake. But the wonderful thing was the Americans made the same mistake I did when I was interpreting it, and passed on the message for real to the Shah, and then didn't dare, once they realised the mistake, didn't dare correct it. They let the Shah think. So she was an unwitting agent of influence. So there's some of my favourites. But go on, Richard. Top one.
Well, I can't compete with Queen Elizabeth the but I mean, I think what's remarkable is that essentially nobody really wants to kill the Queen. Everybody wants the Queen to visit. So the Queen is able to stop a war. So in 1965, there's a major civil war going on in Sudan. There's been talking about a royal visit for ages, but this civil war's flared up. And essentially, the British diplomats say to all the warring parties, if you keep fighting, the Queen's going to regard you as very naughty boys, and she's not going to visit. So eventually, the various warring parties get together and say, this is terrible. If we keep fighting, the Queen isn't going to come. So essentially the war stops, the Queen visits, it goes splendidly, and on the second day there's a reception, and the head of the revolutionaries turns up to pay his respects to the Queen, and he presents himself as the chief of Her Majesty's Loyal Communist Party. And actually after the royals left, peace continued. So actually, the Queen has this extraordinary effect on international affairs sometimes.
It really, I have such a new appreciation for the role that she played for such a long time. But I also gained a real understanding of the very real danger that the royals faced from terrorism. Now, you mentioned Northern Ireland, but the plot surrounding the investiture of Prince Charles as the Prince of Wales in Wales sounds like a tragedy waiting to happen. But the Queen understood the family was in the happiness business and had to be seen without a heavy layer of protection. Can you share some of the most extraordinary tension that you discovered between security and showmanship, and how intelligence worked to keep the royals safe?
Well, this was a dangerous event, the royal investiture, because there were real plots by Welsh nationalists to attack the royal family. They went wrong, really, because the Welsh nationalists were avid dog lovers. So the original plan of attack was to use suicide dogs to attack the royal family, to strap explosives to dogs, send them towards the royal family during the ceremony. But of course, about half the Welsh nationalists are dog lovers. So actually, this plot caused dissension amongst the radicals before it even took place. So some of the Welsh nationalists kind of ratted their friends out. So the suicide dogs never got to have their attack at the royal family.
All right. Anything?
This was a very dangerous event, and the entire royal family is on a royal train, and this was, as the Prime Minister recognized at the time, an absolutely prime target for terrorists. So on the train, the Queen Mother says to Prince Charles, who of course is the star of the show, "I'm sorry, there's so many threats, it's so dangerous. Tomorrow your role's going to be played by a body double." For about an hour, the whole royal family keep up this charade and kind of, and eventually Prince Charles rumbles that he's not going to be played by a body double. So, it's just fabulous to think of the royal family on this train, all actually genuinely likely to be blown up. And they're all having a joke about it. They're all having a party. It's hilarious.
Which then drives... That then drives the intelligence services mad. You can imagine that tension when their job is to keep these people safe, and these people, and going all the way back to Queen Victoria, they don't want to be driven around in armored cars away from their people. The Queen used to like to say, "I need to be seen to be believed," and if she wasn't out, shaking hands and doing the Queen thing, she feared, and I think quite wisely, that the monarchy would wither and die if she wasn't out with her people. So she had to be seen to be believed, which caused all sorts of headaches for the poor intelligence services. And again, highlighted the importance of good intelligence, because we all know that having accurate and timely intelligence can avert disaster and lessen the need for thousands of troops and armored cars and all that kind of thing, which she hated.
Well, I have one last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience in our last few minutes. But you go over Princess Diana and her death in an objective way. We know people have lots of thoughts and feelings expressed in books and movies and TV shows. And I appreciated the conclusions you drew, but so much has been written about her, but I think the discussion that is most relevant to the Spy Museum audience about Diana relates to conspiracy theory. I don't want to spoil those who plan to read the book, but if you would share your thoughts on that, that would be amazing.
Yes, I mean, we've looked at the evidence. There were 3 inquiries. Actually, the last inquiry produced some amazing documents because the heads of MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ gave evidence to some of those inquiries. We are convinced this was not a conspiracy, partly because Diana chose to go to Paris at very short notice. And when a secret service is a bureaucracy. When they kill somebody, there are forms to fill out, there's paperwork to do. It's just not credible that a secret service would have done this at 24 hours notice. But what's also clear, and I think fascinating, is that Diana herself was a conspiracy theorist, in the sense that she believed there were a number of conspiracies afoot, and she used her own royal contacts to kind of explore those things, get in touch with members of the secret services, and to try and find out what was going on. And really, a lot of her behavior in the 1990s, and indeed, in some ways, her lack of royal protection when she went to Paris in 1996 had a lot to do with her desire to separate herself from the secret state. And sadly, our conclusion is if her royal protection, if her professional protection had been in place in 1996, those sad events would not actually have happened.
Well, we'll take away the images and we've got some questions coming in through email, and I encourage our guests to ask anything you're intrigued by, but you do not go into too much detail about the couple who are now living in California, Harry and Meghan, but I felt like learning about the security issues of the royals over time made me a little bit more sympathetic to their shock at not having security. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Well, certainly we think there's lessons from history here. So I think it's very difficult, exactly as you say, it's very difficult being a royal. There are security issues, but there are even bigger issues being an ex-royal. And we've seen 3 generations of people try and leave the royal family. So obviously Edward and Wallace, then Diana, Princess of Wales, and now Harry and Meghan. And that presents enormous security issues, not just from terrorists, but also kind of fixated persons. One of the really difficult jobs of security is to kind of decide which of these plots and threats are real, because every day people are emailing, people are sending letters saying they're going to do stuff. And as your security team, you've got to work out which of this stuff is a hoax and which of this stuff is real. And it's a bit like being in a casino, actually. So it's not much fun being an ex-royal. It's not much fun being the security team trying to guard an ex-royal.
You mentioned to us beforehand that there is a woman you would love to track down and interview. Our guests are always interested in research questions. She had a role that she might have played in Brazil. Would you want to elaborate on that story involving Princess Anne?
Yeah, well, look, we're always discovering new stuff. I mean, the royals is such a fascinating subject that just because we've published the book, we don't stop. What we've discovered recently is that in the 1980s, Princess Anne, who was very feisty, she was always up for visiting dangerous places. She went to Beirut in the middle of a war. In the 1980s, she was due to visit Brazil, and this was judged as a place which had a significant kidnapping risk. The authorities debated it and said, well, yes, we can go ahead, but we're going to do a little bit of sleight of hand. We're going to do a little bit of a switcheroo. What we're going to do is we're going to dress up the British ambassador's wife as Princess Anne. So if anybody kidnaps Princess Anne, it's not actually going to be Princess Anne. we would love to speak to the ambassador's wife and ask her how she felt about being put in the line of fire. That would be really fascinating.
Anyone knows her, please get the word out. Rory, is there anybody that you wish you could get a hold of?
I'd love to get hold of Princess Anne herself. Forget the ambassador's wife. I go to the top. I've come away with this newfound respect for her, particularly around the kidnapping attempt in the 1970s, when she was physically almost pulled out of a car by the kidnapper, and just was so stoic and kind of, get your hands off me, and that mentality I find so interesting, and then that inevitably causes a review of security arrangements, and even after that, Prince Philip and Princess Anne are still saying, no, we don't want your armored cars, we don't want more police outriders. We'll just crack on. And I'd love to ask her how it felt, and was she scared going forward and going to Lebanon and places. And yeah, I've just got this real newfound respect for her.
Well, we've got a question about Prince Philip, and he's very famous for comments that he makes that some might call jokes, others might call putting your foot in your mouth. What kind of a security concern was he? Was he someone that looked a little bit tricky to deal with, especially in light of some of the scandals of the 1960s?
They did do a bit of due diligence when he married Elizabeth. There was a file on him to check, particularly because of some of his relatives and their connections with Nazi Germany. So there was a discreet investigation into him, which basically found that he was sound. He was not a Nazi sympathizer or anything like that. If anything, he was actually more on the left, on the left side of things. But the scandals then came not from that, but from potential risks around women and partying and being part of this elite clubs that drank from lunchtime into the small hours. And we know that he was wrapped up in, for example, the Profumo affair with the big scandal of the 1960s. How Macmillan described it as a sordid underworld, and ended up apologising to the Queen on behalf of the country. And he had his painting done by Stephen Ward, who was the osteopath at the Society osteopath in the heart of it, and it did create nervousness. It definitely created nervousness, but we also think the FBI might have had a little rummage around. Richard's nodding. Go on, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. So during this 1960 scandal, there's not only investigation of the Duke of Edinburgh's kind of private life, but also the FBI believe that some of these women might also have had contact with JFK. So they're sent across essentially to investigate the American dimensions. this British scandal. But you know, I kind of love the Duke of Edinburgh because he's very unconventional. He's always thinking outside the box. And the thing we liked most actually was that Duke of Edinburgh used his intelligence contacts to pursue his private fascination with UFOs. And in the light of the recent stories, you know, about Congress and UFOs, this is really interesting. So the Duke of Edinburgh essentially had a kind of a UFO map room in Buckingham Palace. He was using all his intelligence contacts with the CIA, America, all this kind of stuff, to investigate something which he found absolutely fascinating, not just UFOs, but also the Loch Ness Monster, sea monsters. He was really interested in Yetis, the abominable snowman. So all this, he was actually quite a kind of a new age figure. He was really into the 60s, very open-minded about all the possibilities of science. Really quite a fun figure, actually.
Well, my wonderful colleagues Hannah and Shauna want to know if you could be a fly on a wall during one decade that's in this huge timeline from Victoria pretty much up to today. What's your decade and why? Where do you want to be a fly on the wall?
My one would be the 1950s because I really want to hear those conversations where she's joking about assassinating Middle Eastern leaders. That I want to be in that room as she's saying that, and also with Suez, with the Suez crisis. Historians are still debating exactly how much she knew and how much her eyebrow she raised at Anthony Eden. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those prime ministerial meetings with the Queen, and we conclude in the book that she did know, and that she did raise her eyebrow. But I'd love to sit in on some of those.
And I think for me, the decade after 9/11. So if you're a top agent doing really dangerous work, infiltrating Al Qaeda, how does MI6 reward you? You are taken for tea and cucumber sandwiches with the Queen. And actually, Prince Charles's role over recent decades is to give awards to really top-serving members of the intelligence services. So yeah, I would love to have sat there on the wall as the Queen had a cup of tea with a top secret infiltrator of Al Qaeda.
Well, Rory and Richard, this has been so much fun. And I have to tell, I want everyone to know the book is available from the Spy Museum store. In no way have we covered all the incredible stories, hair-raising tales, funny moments. You have it all. You've done a really, really brilliant job, and I just can't thank you enough for joining us for this hour. I'm gonna take a quick peek at the Q&A that just rolled in. All right. Let me ask this one quick one. We'll do a 30-second answer. Elizabeth I, who you do touch on in the book, was known for having a spy network too. Do you think her legacy affected Victoria's interest in spying?
Well, I think what we loved about the book was that essentially we got to look at three powerful women. It's, you know, when women appear in the intelligence history, they're often dead bodies. Sometimes they're like field agents. It's very rare that you have three women at the top, three women who really understand intelligence, powerful consumers, essentially powerful directors of espionage. So Queen Elizabeth I, Victoria, Elizabeth II. It's just been fantastic seeing women, you know, using intelligence power in that incredibly intelligent way.
I think that was, I'm glad we squeezed in that answer because you were saying that to us before the program started. So thank you again. It is a terrific book. I see some people mentioning in the chat that they are planning to buy it. So that's very kind. And if you have enjoyed this program with us, please consider making a donation to the Spy Museum because our donors make these kind of events possible, along with community outreach initiatives, exhibit improvements. I've tried to share some of our exhibit during the talk, and care for our collection. And we saw that Sidney Riley box that is on loan and on display. We have to take care of treasures such as that. So, gentlemen, it has been a true pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been great fun.